an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Wall of Storms, chapters 44 and 45, The Voyage of Luan Zya, and An Interlude. In these chapters, we get to see exactly what the fuck happened, at least some of it, to Luan Zya. This man has been through it. Also, though, he had so many chances to not do it. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Kyle for commissioning this episode. Kyle is in the chat. Hello, Kyle. You guys. This chapter, The Voyage of Luan Zya, it's one of those that's like, it's the kind of chapter that if somebody told me, oh, I found that so boring, a part of me would be like, yeah, I get that. But it's exactly the kind of shit that I love. I always want to know, but how did you do that, though? You tell me he was floating on a raft for weeks, and I'm just like, was he? Was he? Come on. That's not happening. I really appreciate this author going through every single little detail of how this dude survived this thing. I need it. I need to know. I want to know. This is necessary for the kind of person that I am. And I think Ken Liu and I have that in common. Because he does the same thing whenever he's describing some bananas piece of machinery. Anything that's like, he's like, all right, look, you didn't ask, but I'm not just going to tell you to believe this thing exists. I am going to give you a borderline overly detailed explanation of every piece of technology involved in the creation of this thing, how it was utilized, the construction of it, who designed it, everything. And I love this shit. So the only thing that I will say is that is a bummer here is that Luan Zya, you know what happens to him. So you are reading this with the awareness of what's coming, and that adds such an element of dread that I found that a little bit tough. I will be honest. Like, you know, I know where this dude winds up. We just saw him at the end of the last chapter, and it ain't good. So I feel at this point, there's times where I think finding out where somebody was, like the kind of like record scratch, probably wondering how I got here. I feel like that works a lot of the time, but I'm not sure that it's gonna work so well here when it's somebody that I like winding up as like completely mutilated as he winds up being. Because a reminder, at the end of the last chapter, he has had both of his eyes put out and his tongue cut out, if I'm not mistaken. And didn't he like lose his hands or something? Like, it was just like such a series of fucking, like I said, mutilations that I just don't even want to remember. A part of me is rejecting the memory. Kyle's in the chat saying, oh boy, you're going to be in for it. Shut up, Kyle. Stop it. Ugh. The dread is bad enough, sir. Okay. We start off with the flotilla that is heading up. Remember, like, you know, way back 3 years earlier as this starts off with Luan on Lutho's luck, heading up north on this journey to like see what he can see. And this is such an interesting thing. Although there was a light wind, instead of tacking against it, The ship was headed directly into the wind with its sails fully extended, acting as air brakes, slowing the ship down as much as possible. The oarsmen were also hard at work, bracing themselves against the oars to slow the ship down even further. Even so, Lutho's luck was plowing ahead through the ocean at a fast clip. Behind it, proud Kunikin and Stone Turtle tacked zigzag courses and sailed as close to the wind as possible, struggling to keep up. As Lutho's luck hesitated at the apex of each swell before dipping down into the trough, it almost seemed about to be lifted out of the sea by whatever was attached at the distant end of the cable. So, the captain, whose name is Thumo, is really starting to be like, what is going on? Because the other end of the line, there is the cable, let's see, I'm trying to find the description so that I don't mess up how this is set up. The drum was prevented from spinning by wedges driven into slots. Attached to it was a cable made up of many twisted strands of silk, whose other end shot into the sky and disappeared into the distance. Though the cable hung between the sky and the ship in a gentle curve familiar to all kite flyers, it was clearly under great tension. So, yeah, this dude keeps on looking up at this cable and being like, what's happening up there? Holy shit. And he's about to be like, you know what? Fuck this. We got to pull out of this, because obviously he's beginning to lose control of things. And all of a sudden, there is this really loud noise. It says a metal hoop descended from the sky along the cable, whistling loudly as the breeze passed through its specially shaped rim. With a sharp clink, it stopped against the drum. The 8 men at the giant winch at the center of the deck jumped into action. As soon as they braced themselves against the spokes of the hub, another sailor brought out a large mallet and knocked free the wedges keeping the drum in place. So then they begin to push against it, and they recite this poem for the timing and reel in this kite. It's 80 feet from corner to corner, which is huge. It's like the size of my house. And it says, the frame constructed from the stoutest bamboo was supporting 3 layers of wings made of lacquered silk. The men continued to winch the kite down. It became apparent that the kite was almost as big as the ship itself, and a gondola dangled beneath the triple wings like a silkworm moth cocoon. And they see Luan Zya in this fucking little cocoon, and this motherfucker is already fucked up. He is frostbitten and gets wrapped up in bandages. His eyes are closed, so at first they're like, is he already dead? Are we serious? And he also, we find out later, had been up high enough that he lost consciousness or close to it because of lack of air. Overall, Luan Zya pushed this shit too goddamn far, and yet it's still apparently not quite far enough. And he says that the view was so incredible he didn't want to come back down, and all of the fucking dreaminess you can imagine. It's just that kind of wow, it was so amazing. God, dude, come on. You don't have any sense of self-preservation. We see later that he does, but he needs to be pushed so much further than he should have to be in order for that to kick in. And I really appreciate Thumo being yeah, you're over here talking about how you get to see what the immortals see. Bitch, you almost died. You are very mortal, and you got to keep that shit in mind. And Zya is just well, that would be a worthy way to die. And I'm just come on. And I really love Thumo in this whole scene, because every time that Luan Zya starts to be but the vision, but the scope of the thing, Thumo's there are people on this ship, dude. You're not up there all alone, floating around, only responsible for your own life. We're down here risking ourselves, worried about you, with no idea what the fuck is going on. It would be cool if you could be considerate of that. You know what, Thumo? You're right. You know, like, it's one thing to be cavalier like this with your own life, which I think is stupid anyway, but if it's up to you. But you're not up here alone, Luan Zya. Come on, stop it. And he says that he almost like winched him down against his wishes already. That there were just a couple of times that he almost made the call. And Luan Zya says it might be possible to construct ships that rely on kites as sails to move far faster than conventional ships. Maybe a way to skim above the waves. And Thumo's like, look, you got me fucked up if you think I am interested in this newfangled shit. I like a boat that I know where it is, that I know how to steer it. If you want to go out in these weirdo kite ships you're talking about and mess around, fine. But we're not here for your little experiments right now. So get back into this fucking ship, get warm, drink some tea, and shut the fuck up for a second. So he says, remember how I spoke to you of the way the islands appeared as mere indistinct tan patches set against a blue background from such heights? None of the details of mountains and valleys were visible. All that was left were large patterns. When I lived among the people of Tan Adu, I learned that the ocean was not a featureless expanse, but a tapestry woven with intricate patterns visible only to those whose hearts were still and whose minds had been primed for generations to appreciate its rhythms. The Aduans had detailed maps of the currents that flowed across the ocean, both on the surface and below it like gilt strands in plain cloth, which actually does sound pretty cool. What I saw from my cocoon reminded me of those maps. The ocean in the north was a pale blue canvas upon which were inscribed a masterpiece of complex patterns. Long flowing arcs like the tentacles of the octopus, intricate curlicules like the swirl of the nautilus, bold, thick strokes of starburst passion that demonstrated the brush painter's skill and soul. So yeah, again, he's just going off with his dreamy, all of the way this all looked. But then guys, we get some shit that I did not expect. So pardon me while I take a sip here. You know how this book is called A Wall of Storms? Turns out that's not a metaphor. I thought that was just going to be like, oh, you're coming up against some real opposition. And that opposition is very fierce. It's like a wall, but made of storms. I thought it was just some shit like that. No. It is exactly what it sounds like. There was a wall of white, like seeing the spray and foam at the top of a line of waves, but at that scale, as high as mountains. He stares at it and then begins to see that it's like hurricanes, typhoons, all of these things twisted together. And that the wall was at the limit of his vision and he could not see beyond it. Thumo says, were you seeing the ramparts of the palace of Tazu? And Luan Zya is like, I don't know, but I'm guessing everybody else who's tried to come this way, they fucking hit that shit. And I only got to see it before we hit it because I was up in the kite. So be careful. Yeah, he is, and this is the key difference between him and Thumo. His thing is, be careful, you need to know what's coming. Thumo's like, oh, you mean we should turn around, which is a reasonable thing to think Luan Zya means at this point. Unfortunately for Thumo, that is indeed not what he means, because that is not how he rolls. He says we are to sail into it and through it. Thumo is like, dude, did we not just talk about how there are people on these ships? And Luan Zya is like, well, but don't you want to know what's on the other side and like, face your fears? And Thumo's like, man, that's just selfish. What do you think you're even asking me this? Like, stop it. Luan Zya eventually admits to himself that he's a little bit relieved because he didn't want those guys' lives on his conscience or his responsibility. But I have to admit that I lost a little bit of respect for him here because he is so prepared to assume everyone else wants to risk themselves the way he does. If there wasn't a Captain Thumo there to slap him in the face and be like, some of these people have family they care about. Maybe get a little harsh and be like, look, I know you and Gin split up and that you haven't got anybody, but we do. We're not alone in the world and we don't want to do this. If he wasn't there to do this and Luan Zya was the captain, would he have just sent these dudes through? Like, I think he would. And what the fuck? Guy, Zomi would be very disappointed in you. Christ. So then we cut ahead a little bit and he says like, once we get to that wall, you can determine what we should do, but I do want you to see it at least. And we have everybody staring at it, jumping ahead, talking about like the way that the air and water are spinning and that there is like this rumbling of thunder that just doesn't seem to stop. And it makes the water sort of quake and the deck of the ship is shaking and that there is like lightning that just is going off all over the place from inside. It is seriously intimidating. And understandably, everybody is basically like, welp, this is the barrier into like the land of the gods, clearly. I guess that mortals are not meant to pass through it, which I am not a person who really believes in gods. But if I came across this fucking thing, you could convince me. I think I would be open to that interpretation because what the fuck else are you going to think, So Luan Zya says himself that he always thought when he had heard of the Wall of Storms in the ancient sagas that he thought it was a myth, that it was a classical myth about, much like I did, a metaphor for something. And Thumo tells him, all right, I came to see it. I did what you wanted. Now we're going to go. And Luan's like, okay, you can go. He's like, what do you mean? And he says, you're going to sail south, launch the kite, and cut me free. And I am just going to go through it because this shit is bananas. And I cannot just turn around and go home after seeing something like this and not find out what the fuck is going on. Which, all right, the thing is, as much as I think Luan Zya is an idiot with the way he's willing to risk everybody else, once he decides to do this, I'm kind of like, okay, I kind of get that though. The thing is that normally when somebody takes a risk like this in a book, my response is always like, you haven't done any research. You need to go and find the equipment you need, find people who know some things, get your shit in order before you go venturing out and doing this. But Luan Zya is in this unique position here where he has so many resources at his disposal already that they are all here with him. This is like these ships and the support that he has had up until this point is as good as he's going to get. Any further research does not mean that he's going to come better equipped in the future. This is it. And also the whole thing it's a myth. It's not something that anybody really has believed in. And therefore, research, I don't think, would have done him any good because he would not have probably paid the attention he should because he wouldn't have believed it was a real thing, So at this point, I'm starting to be like, all right, fine. If you want to go off on your own and do some shit, then that's fine. So I love this. Let's see. There was still no ring that came whistling down, indicating Luan Zya's wish to return. Captain Thumo was a dutiful man. Though he gritted his teeth and glanced at the taut cable, he gave an order that was passed to Stone Turtle and Proud Kunikin. And they used their grappling hooks to pull one another together to hold their formation. That's the word I'm looking for. And this ring flies down. He was about to give the order to start winching the kite when the deck lurched beneath his feet and surprised shouting erupted on all three ships. And he looks up and realizes that the cable has been cut from up above. And the force that had disappeared had caused the vessels to careen forward out of control. They managed to get it handled, but that's like, he almost ruins everything by just letting all these ships get cut free at once. And there's a ribbon tied to the drum that says, "I can't come so far without taking a final step. Be safe." So of course Thumo is basically like, all right, well, he's dead, I guess. That sucks. I respected him. He was, a very gentle and in many ways kind person. And is unexpected. But he turns around and tells everybody to head back, thinking that I might be sad that I've lost my friend. But all of these sailors are going to be very relieved to hear that we can turn around and get the hell out of here. And then he sees all of these sailors having this reaction of despair. And he turns around. One of the cyclones had separated from the rest like a dancer moving away from the pack, dwarfing even the Tazu whirlpool of the maelstrom, dwarfing even the Tazu whirlpool if the maelstrom were lifted into the air. It headed straight for the ship, a sinuous, gyrating, predatory monster. A wall of water as high as the tallest tower in the palace in Pan rose before the cyclone and pushed at the boat like baying hounds before a hunter. Thumos shouted for his crew to man the sails and the oars, but they already knew that they were doomed. Y'all, I'm so irritated. This motherfucker just had to get close to this fucking thing. He couldn't help it. Like, if you had just been like, fine, give me a rowboat, I'll go. That's one thing. But he had to get right up close and get his fucking kite up there. And you still wound up sentencing all these men to death. I am mad at you. I am irritated. And, there's a part of me that really feels like losing your eyes and your tongue because it was a really selfish move. You wanted to know about a thing and you didn't care about how dangerous this was. I almost feel like that's what you fucking get. But I don't want to be that cold-hearted, but I'm mad about it. I just, these days, I am a lot more sensitive to seeing people as disposable than I have been in the past. It's always been something that's like, it's disgusting. But with this crisis and the people who are considered essential and being asked to put their healths and their lives on the line, and them often being the same people who are only being paid $10 an hour and get no respect from any of their customers, it's really frustrating to see that a character that I respected so much was so thoughtless about all of the people that had gone with him on this little, expedition. And I'm just annoyed. So anyway, Luan Zya, we go to him on his kite, And he's thinking about, like, not only how he's relieved that he didn't have to risk the lives of the crew, but also realizing that that's probably why he has refused all of the positions that he was offered under Kuni, because he doesn't like people depending on him, and he just didn't want that kind of responsibility. To which I'm like, okay, you might have not taken the position, but you still had a responsibility here just now, and you didn't do well with that shit. So maybe a title isn't the only thing you should take into account, re responsibility, sir. Just saying, you know? He would strategize and scheme, but when the moment came to order men to die for his visions, he lacked the necessary conviction of purpose and the willingness to accept the consequences of his decisions. Better to soar through the sky on a kite alone. That had always been the role he was more comfortable with. Whatever he decided, the only life he was responsible for was his own. Which, again, knowing what we know just happened, the irony of him thinking this to himself is just very thick. So he is gliding through using these like connections on his kite, because it's actually like, you know, when you say kite, you just think of it as being like a very simple sort of apparatus. But he is able to control the direction that he's going in and whatnot, like the way that you can with a modern hang glider or something, you know? And he's going through the storm. There was a bright flash that seemed to blot out the entire world. His skin tingled as though it had a separate life, and the last thought he had was, so being struck by lightning feels a bit like being lit on fire. And then he wakes up. And this is written so well. It took me a second to understand what was happening here, as it takes him a second to understand what's happening here. He wakes up and he's like, oh shit, I'm still alive. Well, how about that? And feels himself being like lifted up and set down. And he's like, am I still flying? What the fuck is going on? And then he sees something like flying past him and thinks it's a bird. And he's like, man, first of all, a bird in this storm, that's crazy. Second of all, though, that bird is real slow. I don't know how it's flying when it's like, what is this? And then he starts to realize that he can't breathe, thinks maybe I'm still too high up, and finally puts it together that he is underwater. And he has to get the fuck out of this thing that has sunk at this point. He manages to get out of here. I love that he says, it would have been nice to see the new lands before I die, but every journey has an end. Yeah, I do appreciate him being like, well, I did this so that I could see something, but I guess, all right. With the last glimmer of consciousness, he released the unknown object from the folds of his robe. A book emerged. Its pages fluttered like the wings of a bird in slow motion, leaving trails of dissolving ink behind it. The pale pages seemed to glow with golden letters. It was Gitre Uthu, the magic book that had been given him by Lutho. Luan Zya reached for the book, grabbed onto the spine with the last of his strength, and he felt himself being dragged toward the surface. So the book saves him, basically. And it says he clung to the frame of the floating kite, and the sea, the part of the sea he was in was perfectly calm. The frame of the downed kite creaked, and eventually he looks at the book, and a golden line of text like appears on it, and it says, "You are on your own. That's a good thing." Now, this is an interesting thing. Luan Zya later on is thinking to himself that he had wondered whether there was a limit to where the gods could go and where they could have influence. And we eventually hear the gods talking about this and find out that indeed this area, they're not able to like come in and help him necessarily. Like they don't really know what it is they're dealing with exactly either. And because of that, saying you're on your own, that's a good thing, feels like a little bit of a fib. It feels like a god trying to give him some comfort because they realized you are on your own is a bit harsh and they wanted to soften it a little bit. But it doesn't seem like they necessarily know. So Luan Zya manages, like, throughout this basically he's floating and trying to, like, as he's floating, pull pieces of things together to create a raft and eventually a sail, and pulls himself up onto this. And he fishes with string torn from his robe and a hook made out of the bronze clip for his hair bun. When he was thirsty, he drank the rainwater collected on the top of his tent, and it rained nearly every day. And he keeps on waiting to see land, and it's just not materializing. From time to time, the typhoons and cyclones that made up the wall of storms would part and reveal a narrow opening like a channel between two land masses. These calm valleys between storm mountains sometimes lasted for hours or even days before the wall closed up again. Luan speculated that if one could discern the pattern in their movements, it might be possible to sail through the wall safely. Once in a while, one of the cyclones left its place in the wall and wandered erratically over the open sea, causing Luan's heart to leap into his throat with concern that it might be headed for his raft. Luckily, the gyrating twisters seemed to always steer clear of his course, but he wondered if other travelers who had come this way had been as fortunate. After all, he knew no man who had seen the wall and returned to Dara to tell of it, save for a few cryptic references in ancient sagas. Perhaps the wall had its own ideas about who it would let through and who it would allow to depart its vicinity unmolested. That's a pretty interesting thought, that it's got a consciousness of its own, you know? So he's got this book, and he manages to, like, make some ink to write in it from a squid that he catches. He catches another fish and takes one of the bones to make the pen for it, and tries to write some poetry, keep track of what's happening to him. And he also is trying to create a map and maybe pay enough attention to the pattern himself to detect what is going on here. Sometimes the pages he wrote on still held faint traces of his old notes, and he smiled as he remembered what a different man he had been when he had written those notes, when overthrowing Mapidere had appeared as a task more important than any other in the world. So eventually, he begins to float far enough away from the wall of storms that it is almost completely out of sight. And he realizes belatedly how much the wall was sort of his link to Dara, and that not being able to see it at all anymore is kind of fucking him up a little bit. And I actually really appreciated that being mentioned, because that's how it is with things like this. Like, you don't realize that's how you see a thing as your, like, last link to home until it gets taken away, and all of a sudden you feel very adrift, literally and figuratively. And all of a sudden you're like, oh shit, that thing meant something to me and I didn't even realize it. And that's just not something that I would have thought of. I liked that this author, like, really seemed to put himself in Luan's shoes there and be like, how would I feel about this, you know? So the current shifts to the south, and eventually he starts to, like, recognize some of the constellations and stuff, which I was surprised by. I sort of thought maybe he wouldn't know anything about anything of his surroundings and where he is. And he's thinking to himself about Gin. And it says he hoped that Gin would finally take his advice to heart and give up her pride and the yearning for ostentatious displays of honor and glory. And then he stops and really thinks about it. And he's like, why am I asking her to do this? Why do I want her to give that up? That's like me giving up everything that I want, which means that I wouldn't even be the person I am. So acting like I want her to stop wanting these things is me being like, hey, stop being who you are real quick so that you can be more likable to me. Maybe you could be more convenient to me. And I really appreciated him having the presence of mind to see that. As the weeks went by, the patterns in the sky continued to change. Now Luan Zya spent each night charting new stars. He could feel the weather changing as well. The sun rising higher at noon, the temperature growing warmer. And this is all going fairly well. And I was starting to be like, this is almost like nice. But we quickly start to realize that is because it's been a short time yet. And gradually it begins to get much, much more difficult. The fish that he's finding, that he's fishing up and having to eat, some of them are barely even edible because they have so much, they have so many tiny bones. Some of them have like sand in their bellies because like I guess they have like the equivalent of a gizzard. Others left his stomach in painful knots and he had to vomit up what he had eaten. One caused him to become lightheaded and lose feeling in his limbs. By the time he woke up weak and dehydrated, he wasn't sure how many days had passed. So he starts painting pictures of the fishes and labeling them and trying to keep track of what he has eaten and remember which ones made him sick and not, so that he can remember to avoid those. Very smart. He's very lucky that he has this book with him. Not luck, I guess. That was the gods intervening. So gradually it gets really hot. The rain begins to become very scarce. His skin is blistering in the sun and from the salt. He's having to drink his own urine. He is really starting to struggle. And at this point, he starts thinking that he should just die. Like, he's low-key wanting to simply die. And he could probably toss himself off this raft and let himself drown. But I get the sense that he's not even like, doesn't even exactly have the energy to roll himself off the raft at this point. Like, it's just a really bad scene. And I love this line, and it has been highlighted by 67 people, according to Kindle. He, first leading up to it, he thinks about all of the conflicts that he has like gone through in his life where he never even considered giving up. But yet here he was asking for the peace of death, too tired and hungry and thirsty to continue the basic struggle to stay alive. What courage it took for the starving and the poor to continue the mere act of existence, of survival, of endurance. Such quiet acts of heroism were not celebrated, and yet they made up the foundation of civilization far more than all the honorable sentiments of the Ano sages and the pretty words of the nobles. That is some real shit, guys. That is some real shit right there. So he wakes up thinking, like, he passed out pretty much assuming that he was going to die in his sleep. He wakes up and he gets knocked in the head with a coconut that's floating in the water near him. And he gets really excited because he's so hungry. And then he realizes that this thing is locked up so tight that it's right here in the palm of his hands, but he can't get at what he needs in it. It's the equivalent of like the Looney Tune where there's a can of food and there's no can opener. You know, like exactly that. And he loses his shit here. He's just like, at first, he's just trying to figure out any way to open it. Nothing's working. Then he starts to pray and be like, will anybody fucking do anything? And then eventually he just screams. And If he were less delirious, the noises he made might have reminded him of the song of whales and crubins. Eventually, the noises grew fainter and then stopped. And all of a sudden, there's a crubin that surfaces right next to the raft. And he's like, what does it want? Because there are 4 of them eventually. 3 smaller creatures between Luan Zya and the hulk of the crubin. Miniature versions of the great crubin. They gazed up at Luan Zya with curious eyes, the silvery scales on their backs shimmering in the bright sun. As Luan Zya gazed at the baby crubins, astonished, they spouted one after the other through their blowholes, and the sprays of mist drenched Luan Zya's face. And he can hear them like starting to laugh. And they raise themselves up out of the water on their tails and like make noises at him. And he realized that they have these horns on their head, that the other like full grown crubins, they would be way too big for this job. But this baby one, it's the right size. One of them bent and pointed the horn at the pile of coconuts on the raft. Dumbfounded, Luan Zya picked up one of the coconuts and crawled over to the edge of the raft, and as the baby crubins backed up, chirping excitedly, he dropped it into the water. They dove out of sight, and the water exploded as they shoot up from the depths, striking the coconut with its horn. It sprang into the air before falling back down. Just as it was about to hit the surface, a second baby crubin surfaced and struck it with its horn, and it arced away, and it flies towards Luan Zya, who grabs it, and there are holes in it. And it's like basically the equivalent of them playing like beach volleyball and just happening to pierce the ball in exactly the way he fucking needs. And they keep on playing with him until he's opened like 6 coconuts and managed to drink as much water as he needs. And those of you who like know about coconut water, that shit is loaded with nutrients. Like that is really good stuff. Not necessarily necessary if you are somebody who's living a sedentary life, but if you are starving to death and dehydrated, like that's a recipe for exactly what you need. So he starts to think maybe there's land nearby because of these coconuts, but it has gone, like it goes on a while and he still doesn't see any land, and he's starting to be like, well, maybe not. He sees a city at one point with streets, and he thinks that he can tell like that there's vehicles and stuff, and is trying to get their attention. But he hasn't got any way to signal. There's no way to get them to notice him. And eventually, he decides, because it goes away, that it must have been a mirage of some kind. And then he's like, well, if it's a mirage, oftentimes that is caused by light reflection from an actual object. So maybe there is like a small town or something somewhere. And he thinks about being able to bend light to send a signal. So he has like the porthole from his little cocoon that he messes with to make it into a lens that he can like manipulate the light. As all of this is happening, his teeth are getting loose in his head. His skin is like getting mottled. Like his health is really starting to deteriorate because he does not have what he needs to stay alive. But he does manage to use this lens to create a fire and is able to use smoke to try and signal, is able to cook the food that he's eating, which is a nice change. But at last he had a way to make fire, and that was something he was immensely cheered. The knowledge he had gained in his travels through Dara was still worth something. The fire eventually went out, but hope had returned to his heart. Eventually we get to a point where he's just like, I don't know how long I've been on this fucking raft. We don't get a particular, I am assuming at this point that we're in like 3 weeks, maybe a month, maybe longer. I'm trying to think how long you have to go without nutrition, like that's adequate for your teeth to grow loose. Maybe it's longer than that, actually. I don't know how long that, I don't really know how long that takes. So one day he realized the current had slowed down and turned north. He tried to steer with the sail again, and the raft actually made progress against the languorous flow. For the entirety of the time he had ridden this current, Luan had sought to escape it, but now it seemed as if he was saying goodbye to an old friend. So he gets off of that current, and he's, really starting to be like, I think I'm going to lose my mind. I'm starting to think that I am not going to make it, or if I do, that I'm going to be broken. And eventually the weather begins to get colder. So actually, I'm realizing if he's experiencing like seasonal changes, it's got to be way longer than a month. This has got to be months now, right? Unless it's supposed to be the changes aren't seasonal changes, but changes of location because of climate. I wonder. So then he starts seeing floating, seaweed, floating vines and twigs and things. He starts to see birds. He keeps thinking, well, there must be land nearby. And he keeps being disappointed. And finally, eventually, there is a coastline. And he manages to get this raft basically beached. And when his feet hit the ground, it just feels so unnatural to him. He's like, whoa, he can barely walk. And it says, he saw that some men and women, pale-skinned and light-haired, had emerged from the mushroom-shaped tents to gaze at him in wonder. Before the sea, all men are brothers, he croaked, then collapsed against the beach. To which I'm like, are they? Because from what we see, it does not appear to be the case. But, oh, buddy. So here we go to chapter 45, an interlude. And this is where we get to talk to the gods again. Where have you been, old turtle? Away at the edge of the world to probe at the wall of storms again. What did you find? Terror of the unknown, I still could not pass through. You know we aren't supposed to cross it, brother. Our mother told us that Moano created it to mark Dara apart. But the world beyond has come to Dara as well as new gods. We have not felt the power of these new gods yet. Perhaps they are still weak from their journey. I love when they talk about other gods the way that we would talk about other people. Like there is no suggestion that the gods are that they are outside of fatigue or some of the, the things that human beings fall prey to as well. And eventually he says that he is wondering maybe if the wall of storms is meant to only be passed through by mortals, and the gods aren't even like, it's just, and they all sort of stop dead because they are so used to there being things that are off limit to mortals, but the gods have access to, that the idea there is something that is in the reverse is just like unthinkable. Lutho, why didn't you follow your protege beyond the wall when he broke through 3 years ago? I tried to help him as much as I could, but I felt my power weaken as I tried to reach beyond that barrier. Our power comes from these islands, and we cannot leave our home without becoming mortal, which is really interesting. Maybe that means the gods of these strangers also could not leave their home. The Liuku have left their gods behind. So I love this. They don't know. The gods are not all knowing. They are as limited as the mortals are in their way, So then we come back to Zomi, and it's the present again. And both of them, her father and Luan Zya, have been given drugs to send them off to sleep. And the doctor, when she's just like, are they going to make it? The doctor's like, honestly, I cannot believe that they are still alive. Like, search me, kid, how this is even possible right now. And I just like, I feel so bad for her that this is the reunion that she gets. Ouch, man. You know, that just, I don't know. That just seems really like cruel. I hope, Ken, that you're going to do me a favor here and not make this just a torment to me. Do me a favor, buddy. Give me some respite pretty soon, because I'm getting bummed out. And yeah, that is the end of the chapter, is Rest Father, Rest Teacher. Behind her, the generals and advisors and soldiers waited for her to read more. Because she has been reading the journal that he has kept, which, despite the fact that he has been like completely mutilated, apparently they let him keep his journal, which that's nice of them. I mean, it helps to have like this story, written down in such a way as to ensure that people are going to believe it in a way that they would not believe it if he were just to tell it. Like, some guy comes back after going through something like this, assuming he even has his tongue and his eyes still, and he tells you he came across this wall of storms and floated around for like a fucking, 6 months. You're going to start to be like, buddy, I think the sun started to get to you. And there's nobody to contradict his story. The ships that he went out with never came back. So I could understand if maybe people didn't buy it. But there's a journal with, months worth of notes and very detailed notes at that. It's not just journal entries of just like, oh, today it was sunny. There's like drawings of the fish that he's coming across. There's maps that he has made of the lands beyond. This is a really valuable wealth of information here, in as much as one man from his very limited perspective from this raft could do much, The question is now why he was subjected to this torture. And I assume it was for intelligence, but if that were true, I don't know why he was kept alive and allowed to return. Well, he isn't allowed to return. They wind up like, I forgot about how they come back, but yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of questions. So this is the first time that I have finished covering the chapters, and I have a little bit of time left. Kyle, do you have any questions before I wrap up? I don't really have much more to say about this because it's pretty direct what happens here. But like I said, I could understand if somebody didn't like this chapter because it can be sort of, there's a monotony to it. But I think that's the point. I think I appreciate it for the fact that it got across to me what this was probably like and gave me a lot of detail as to how he survived. My main question is what he was burning to make the fire, because it says that the fire went out. I don't even remember, actually. Let's see. The fire eventually went out. I'm trying to find the spot. Oh, he broke one of the bamboo spars he had been using as an oar into small short sticks, piled them in a platform made from one half of the hard jujube cocoon. Stuffing some dried... Damn it, I turned the page. I hate when I do that. Stuffing some dried coconut husks under the bamboo sticks as kindling, he was ready to light a fire. He held up his lens. After a few seconds, smoke rose from the pile. He waited until the smoke grew thick and a tiny tongue of flame flickered to life. Putting the lens aside, he bent down and blew on the flame gently, trying to keep it alive. After a while, when the fire was big enough, he tossed torn strips of silk onto the flames. The silk burned slowly and generated a lot of smoke. He hoped that he was still close enough to land that the smoke would draw attention. That's right. let's see. Kyle says, not really. We got another one next Saturday. It's going to be a juicy one. Yay. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to wrap it up then. Thank you again, Kyle, for commissioning this. I hope that I try and mention this book series as much as I can when people ask me. So I hope that I'm getting some new readers onto this series. But yeah, all right. Well, I hope that I get to see some people on Saturday. You can check the Facebook events if you want to know when that is. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.